The role of ego and perceiving your reality. The ego is similar to a lens. Your senses enable the ability to witness and absorb the environment. The ego allows you to go beyond to perceive and understand it. The ego is similar to a lens upon which you can perceive both externally and internally. The reason why the ego gets a bad rap is because the lens that many people have to perceive their environment is blocked with layers and layers and layers of cloudiness. So they are unable to perceive it with the clarity and the purity of which the ego was originally intended for. The cloudiness of the ego lens is due to the weight or the density of each individual's energy. This includes emotional attachments, false beliefs, illusions, judgments, and low vibrations that you might be holding within. The clarity and purity of the ego lens is due to the lightness of each individual's energy, which includes ultimately the purity and connectivity of the inner child shining from within. Everything in your internal and external environment is perceived through the ego. The ego is a necessary foundation of a human experience. To hold a perception that you can get rid of ego is similar to holding a perception that you can get rid of a personality. A personality absolutely changes as new beliefs or expanding consciousness is integrated, but there will always exist a type of personality unique to each individual for as long as you hold an individual experience. This is because personality is directly linked to expression, and ego is directly linked to interpretation and perception. Much like personality, the ego, or the ability to interpret and perceive, can absolutely change and shift in accordance with new belief systems or expanding consciousness. But ego is unique to each person's ability to perceive their environment. The reason is because ego holds our recognition of self, and a sense of self cannot be extinguished for as long as a unique experience is integrated with a self-aware mind. There are, of course, many layers of self-recognition within the ego and mind. It is not just one layer. The more layers of cloudiness that exists upon the lens of ego, the more the sense of self is perceived as illusionary. The clearer the ego lens is, the more that we're able to perceive ourselves and our environment with clarity, truth, and purity. The ego is the liaison between you and your higher self, you and your external environment, you and your internal environment, which includes your unconscious and your subconscious and your conscious, and even you and your lower self. Without ego, you would not be able to perceive a self-constructed reality simply because your ego allows you the ability to recognize yourself within all things, and all things to be recognized within the self. The ego helps to build that establishment of how you are connected or related to any specific thing in your reality. When the ego lens is layered with cloudiness, or in other words, your self-recognition is more in alignment with illusion, then the perception of connectivity also diminishes, and a perception of separation and division is strengthened. On the other hand, when the ego lens is clear or more clear and more pure, meaning it's more in alignment with a self-recognition of truth, then the perception of connectivity strengthens and the perception of separation diminishes. Can you imagine yourself walking around with glasses on that are so thick with layers of cloudiness or dirt that you cannot see through them? Of course you would feel separate from your environment and you would pick up on false illusions. But if you are walking around with glasses that were clear and open, you would have the opportunity to feel more in tune with your environment and more connected in truth through that clarity. Your spiritual journey is not so much about getting rid of the ego as much as it is about clarifying that lens upon which you perceive your inner and outer environments and sense of self. The clearer your lens becomes through healing and self-awareness, the less ego you tend to feel, because the separating aspects that add to a dense ego begins to lift into more connectivity and lightness. What you may have heard as ego death is experienced when this shift occurs rapidly without a soft or a slow transition between that cloudy, illusionary lens and a clearer, more truthful lens. But when you shift more slowly through healing and self-awareness, you begin to also slowly feel the shift of that ego connection. You feel that shift of how the ego is serving you. And that's powerful because you are feeling that in alignment with how you are perceiving your environment or your reality. The ego is a valuable tool in how you perceive your environment and also how you recognize yourself in all things. And for example, in order to perceive and interpret spiritual downloads, we utilize our understanding of ourselves and our environment. This is because all things pass through the gates of the mind. And although the mind can stretch into realms beyond our immediate physical experience, the ego, which exists as the gatekeeper of the mind, will be what allows us to interpret where the mind goes. The brain does not interpret information, but the brain absorbs and communicates pure energy. The ego, on the other hand, is the efforting aspect of the mind that shares and retrieves information in order to understand the absorbed energy from internal and external environments. So the ego creates understanding and information to the pure energy that the brain is absorbing. So for example, when I receive spiritual messages, I receive them as pure light and energy downloads, just as we all do. But for me to communicate what I'm receiving, I have to interpret that energy into information. So in order for me to understand these energy downloads, my ego works as the liaison to retrieve information that aligns with the frequency of energy that's being activated and integrated as the download that I'm receiving. Sometimes I don't understand the downloads that are coming through, so I just feel it as pure light and energy in the body. And in these specific instances, I know that I will soon experience something in my life to help my ego retrieve the necessary information for my deeper understanding. Or I know that maybe more time is involved because the ego needs to retrieve the information from a very deep place within me. And sometimes in the retrieval of that information, I have to go through my own healing and processing of that information to interpret it or perceive it in the most purest form that it was intended, so that it doesn't have any attachments to it or any emotional attachments to it that I might have in a stored way. This is how a lot of dots are connected and how a lot of my information unfolds for my understanding, my own personal understanding, and therefore my ability to share with other people. To receive any piece of information, including this very message that you're listening to or reading right now, your ego is working as a liaison to interpret it for you as you are absorbing it as pure energy. It may pull up memories to help you better understand the concepts or feelings that are relevant or deeper emotional attachments that are connected. It may also bring into your experience or your awareness something to help you better feel and learn the working message if you don't understand it. So this is what often happens is you might not understand the information you're reading or absorbing, but later down the line, you will experience something in real life that will allow you to look back at this information and be like, oh, now I understand. The ego works with the subconscious in this way. The ego helps to interpret and understand what the subconscious is bringing through in those very, very deep parts of you. So when I was working as a quantum healing hypnosis practitioner, I was working a lot with the subconscious and the ego. And the more that I began to understand the both of them, the more that I realized that they were in many ways working together to help us understand, perceive, and interpret our internal and external environments and energies that we're absorbing. Because how we perceive our reality or anything internally and externally is always going to be determined upon how clear or cloudy the lens of our ego may be. So our subconscious can be bringing up a lot of stuff, but it is all going to pass through our ego lens. So if our subconscious is bringing up a lot of emotional attachments or trauma or fears, if the lens of your ego is still cloudy, then all of that subconscious information is going to then be interpreted and perceived through this illusionary cloudy lens of the ego. But the more that you work on clearing and clarifying that lens, then as that subconscious pulls up a lot of the deeper trauma, emotional attachments, or any other deeper things, then it can be perceived and interpreted and understood through a clearer lens of the ego, through the lens of more truth, essentially, and more inner knowing. So this is just the beginning of a much larger piece of information that came through regarding self-perception, self-understanding, understanding of the self, especially during this time as we transition from an old self into a new self, old earth into new earth. Thank you so much for being here. Oneness, love, and peace be with you.